Colonel Park studied the tactical display showing Githrak's crippled flagship and the one escort vessel that still had power to flee. His weapons officers waited for the order to finish what they had started, to destroy the Keth warlord, who had tried to murder 42,000 civilians. When he realized he could not enslave them, it would have been easy. It would have been justified. It would have been wrong. Open a channel to the Keth flagship. Park ordered. Githrak's face appeared on the screen, and the Keth warlord looked like someone who had already accepted his death and was merely waiting for it to arrive. I assume you are calling to demand my surrender. Githrak said. No, Park replied. I am calling to let you go. The confusion on Githrak's face was almost worth the lives they had lost to reach this moment. You are letting me escape. I am giving you a message to deliver, Park said. You will take your remaining ship, and you will leave Union space. And you will tell every Keth clan what happened here today. Tell them what? That humans are stronger than we expected. Tell them that the next colony they threaten might be protected by humans, Park said. And his voice carried no anger and no triumph. Only the calm certainty of someone stating facts. Tell them they will not know which colonies have human protection until we arrive. And tell them to consider very carefully whether the risk is worth the reward. Githrak stared at the human colonel for a long moment. You want me to spread fear among my people. I want you to spread truth. And whether that truth creates fear is not my concern. Why not simply destroy me and send the message yourself? Park leaned forward slightly, because a dead warlord becomes a martyr. And martyrs inspire revenge. But a living warlord who fled from humans becomes a warning. And warnings save lives. Githrak processed this and slowly nodded. You are not showing mercy. No, Park agreed. I am being practical. The Keth warlord gave a harsh laugh that contained no humor. You humans are more dangerous than the stories suggested. We are exactly as dangerous as we need to be, Park said. Now go. And remember what you have seen. The remaining Keth vessels limped out of the system, and Park watched them go until they vanished into faster-than-light transit. Lieutenant Cho Yuna approached him with a data tablet, showing the casualty reports. 17 dead from the Indomitable, she said quietly. 43 wounded across the battalion. 12 of them critical. Park took the tablet and read through the names of the fallen. These were people he had trained with, served with, trusted with his life and the lives of everyone under his command. They had died so that strangers could live, and he would carry their names with him for the rest of his career. Make sure their families know they died as heroes. He said, Yes, Colonel. 3 weeks later, High Arbiter Kaseth of the Galactic Union convened a formal inquiry into the Threshold 7 incident. The chamber was filled with representatives from dozens of species, all of them watching as Yoon Seok-jin took her place at the testimony podium. Coordinator Desik had filed a complaint alleging that she had exceeded her authority by invoking Article 7C, and the inquiry was meant to determine whether human response protocols should be restricted in the future. Kaseth, an ancient being whose species have been navigating galactic politics since before humans discovered fire, studied her with eyes that had seen empires rise and fall. Liaison Yun, he said. You called for a military response that exceeded standard Union protocols by a factor of 100. And you did so for a colony of minimal strategic importance. I called for a response proportional to the threat. Seo-jin replied. The threat was 14 Keth raiders, hardly an existential danger to Union stability. The threat was to 42,000 lives. Arbiter, and I measured my response against that number. Kaseth made a gesture that his species used to indicate careful consideration. Your response resulted in significant casualties among human forces and the destruction of multiple Keth vessels. My response resulted in 0 civilian deaths, Seo-jin said, and I consider that outcome worth every price we paid to achieve it. The chamber stirred with murmured conversations in a dozen different languages. Kesseth raised a limb for silence. Liaison Yun. If humans respond this way to a Maya agricultural colony, what would you send for a major population center? Seojin met the Arbiter's ancient eyes without flinching. More. The single word hung in the air of the chamber. And Seojin watched representatives shift uncomfortably in their seats as they processed its implications. You would escalate even further, Arbiter. Humans do not calculate acceptable losses when civilians are threatened, Seojin said. We calculate necessary force, and we apply it until the threat is eliminated. And if that means sending an entire fleet for a single colony, then that is what we will send. This approach could destabilize the careful balance the Union has maintained for centuries. The careful balance of the Union allowed Keth raiders to threaten a colony for 3 days before anyone considered responding. Seojin replied, and there was steel in her voice now. The careful balance of the Union would have sent 30 security personnel to negotiate with a fleet of slavers. And the careful balance of the Union would have resulted in 42,000 people either dead or sold into labor camps. She paused and looked around the chamber at all the representatives, who had allowed that careful balance to persist. Humans do not accept that balance, she said. And we never will. The inquiry ended without formal censure, though Thesek continued to file complaints that no one acted upon on Threshold 7. A Varani journalist named Thema interviewed Colonel Park before the 142nd Battalion departed for their next assignment. What do you want the galaxy to remember about what happened here? She asked. Park stood at the edge of the landing field where his troops were loading equipment onto transport ships. And he watched the Varani children who had come to wave goodbye to the soldiers who had saved them. Remember that someone answered, he said. Remember that when you called for help, we came. Is that a promise for the future? It is a statement of fact about who we are. Thema recorded his words and added them to the story she would broadcast across 100 worlds. Months later, a colony on the far side of Union space sent a distress signal into the void. The colonists were a species that had never interacted with humans, had never heard the stories from Threshold 7, had no reason to believe anyone would answer their call. A human patrol ship detected the signal and changed course immediately on the bridge. A young ensign asked the captain why they were diverting from their scheduled route for people they had never met. The captain looked at the star chart showing the distant colony and thought about all the times humanity had faced the same choice, because that is what we do, she said. The ship accelerated toward the distress signal, and somewhere in the galaxy, strangers discovered they were not alone. Humanity was coming. Humanity would always come. Gethrick stood on the burning bridge of his flagship and made the calculation that every desperate warlord eventually makes. He could not win. His fleet was shattered. His ground forces were captured or dead, and the human ships surrounded him like wolves waiting for the final moment of the hunt. But if he could not have victory, he could at least have revenge. The water purification center sat at the heart of the main Varani settlement, a sprawling facility that processed every drop of drinking water for the entire colony. Without it, the 42,000 civilians below would die slowly over the following weeks, their bodies failing as dehydration took hold. His flagship was crippled, but it still had weapons. It still had the power for one devastating strike. Target the purification facility. Gethrak ordered his weapons officer. Full bombardment. Everything we have left. Warlord. That will kill the civilians we came to capture. If I cannot have them, no one will have them, Gethrick said. And his voice carried the cold certainty of someone who had nothing left to lose. Let the humans save a colony of corpses and explain to the galaxy how their great rescue mission failed. On the bridge of the destroyer Indomitable, Captain Jang Hanul saw the Keth flagship repositioning and understood immediately what Gethrak intended she had served in the Terran Defense Force for 18 years, and she had learned to read the desperate moves of cornered enemies. "Colonel Park," she said into her communication link, "the Keth flagship is targeting the colony surface. Probable aim is civilian infrastructure." Park's voice came back calm and steady. "Can you intercept?" Jang looked at the tactical display and ran the calculations in her head. The Indomitable could move into the firing solution, could place itself between the Keth weapons and the colony below, but doing so would mean taking the full force of the bombardment directly. Her ship had 140 crew members. The colony had 42,000 civilians. "We can intercept," she said, "but we will take critical damage and we will lose people." There was a pause on the communication line, and Jang knew the colonel was weighing the same numbers she had already weighed. "Captain Jang," Park said finally, "the decision is yours." It was not really a decision at all. "Helm," Jang said to her bridge crew, "move us into intercept position and get me shipwide communication." The Indomitable began to move, and Jang activated the communication system that would broadcast her voice to every compartment of her ship. "This is the captain," she said. "We are moving to intercept an orbital bombardment aimed at the colony below. And we are going to take hits, probably bad ones. And some of us are probably not going to make it through the next few minutes." She paused and looked around her bridge at the faces of her crew, at the young officers and the veteran specialists and the technicians who kept her ship running. None of them looked afraid. None of them looked like they wanted to be anywhere else. "We did not come this far to watch them burn," she said. "Brace for impact." The Keth flagship fired everything it had left. Gethrak watched from his command deck as the barrage streaked toward the planet, and he allowed himself a moment of satisfaction knowing that his defeat would at least be remembered. Then the human destroyer moved into the path of his weapons. The Indomitable took the bombardment that was meant for 42,000 innocent people. Explosions rippled across the ship's hull as Keth weapons found their marks, and Jang felt her vessel shudder and scream around her as systems failed and compartments breached, and her crew died in the spaces she could not protect. 17 crew members lost their lives in those terrible seconds. 17 humans who had families and dreams, and futures that would never be realized. The Indomitable survived, barely. Her hull torn open in a dozen places, and her engines failing, and her weapon systems destroyed. But she survived. And below her, the colony survived too, on the surface. Medical Officer Beak Su Yan coordinated the evacuation of civilians from the areas closest to the expected bombardment zone when the bombardment never came. When she looked up and saw the wounded human destroyer hanging in the sky like a broken guardian, she understood what Captain Jang and her crew had done. The Varani around her understood too. They watched the damaged ship and the debris falling from its wounds, and they knew that humans had died in the sky above them so that they could live. Sub-Commander Vrech surrendered to Sergeant Wang less than an hour later. He walked out of his fortified position with his hands raised and his weapons abandoned, and he approached the human sergeant with the careful movements of someone who no longer understood the universe he lived in. "I will submit to your custody," Vrech said, "and I will order my remaining warriors to do the same." Wang nodded and gestured for his squad to take the Keth officer into custody. "Why?" Vrech asked before the soldiers could lead him away. "Why did your ship take that strike for these people? Why did your crew die for a species they have never met?" Wang looked up at the wounded Indomitable, at the vessel that has shielded strangers with its own body. "Because that is what we do," he said. Vrech shook his head slowly. "The Keth fight for profit and glory and the advancement of our clans," he said. "We do not sacrifice ourselves for strangers. We do not spend lives on people who cannot pay us back. No, Wang agreed. You do not. How do you build a military that will die for nothing? Wang met the Keth officer's eyes. We do not die for nothing, he said. We die for everyone, which is the opposite of nothing. Ambassador Revan arrived at the evacuation site as the last of the wounded were being loaded onto medical shuttles. She watched humans carrying their own dead from the wreckage of equipment and vehicles. Watched them treating Keth prisoners with the same medical attention they gave their own soldiers. Watched them hold Varani children and comfort Varani elders and do all the small things that transformed a rescue mission into something more. I do not understand your species, she said to Colonel Park when he came to check on the evacuation progress. Most species do not. Park admitted. You lost people today. Good soldiers who would still be alive if you had simply let the bombardment fall. Yes. Why? Revan asked. And the question carried the weight of a diplomat who had spent her entire career believing she understood how civilizations functioned. Park looked at the small Varani child who had attached herself to Sergeant Wang and refused to let go of his hand. Because she deserves to grow up, he said. And because the price of her future was one we were willing to pay. Above the moon, Gethrak watched the human fleet regroup around his crippled flagship. He had one ship left with functioning engines. Barely enough power to flee. Colonel Park's face appeared on his screen. Warlord Gethrak. The human said, You have a choice to make. The battle lasted less than 2 hours, and it was nothing like Gethrak had expected. He had assumed the humans would approach cautiously, testing his defenses and probing for weaknesses in the traditional manner of civilized warfare. Instead, the human destroyers cut through his formation. Like predators who had already mapped every move their prey would make. The first Keth raider exploded before its captain could finish ordering evasive maneuvers. The second lost its engines too. Precision strikes that seemed almost surgical in their accuracy. By the time Gethrak understood that the humans had somehow predicted his tactical responses before he made them, 3 of his ships were drifting wreckage, and 2 more were crippled beyond repair. He ordered a retreat toward the far side of the moon, hoping to use the planetary body as cover while he regrouped his remaining forces. The human frigates were waiting for him there. It was impossible. And yet it was happening. The humans knew where his ships would go before his helmsman entered the coordinates. They knew which formations he would attempt and which escape vectors he would calculate. They fought as if they had studied every raid the Keth had ever conducted and prepared specific counters for every tactic his people had ever developed. Perhaps they had, perhaps humans were the kind of species that learned from the suffering of others and filed that knowledge away until the moment it became useful. On the surface of Threshold 7, the situation was even more devastating for his forces. Gethrak had landed 400 warriors in the initial occupation, and those warriors had spent 3 days terrorizing the Varani civilians with demonstrations of what would happen to those who resisted his ground commander. Sub-Commander Vrech had reported that the colonists were properly subdued and ready for processing. Then the human dropships descended from the sky. Sergeant First Class Wang Disung led his squad through the central settlement with the methodical efficiency of soldiers who had trained for exactly this kind of operation. The Keth warriors expected frightened herbivores who would scatter at the first sign of violence. They found humans instead. Vrech watched from his command position as his warriors engaged the enemy and discovered something terrifying about human combat doctrine. The humans did not fight as individuals seeking glory. They fought as a single organism with dozens of bodies, each soldier covering the others, each movement coordinated with every other movement, each action part of a larger pattern that left no gaps and offered no opportunities. His warriors were skilled fighters who had won countless battles against countless species. They lasted less than an hour against the human squads, but it was what happened. After the fighting that disturbed Wretch most deeply, the humans did not execute their prisoners. They did not torture the wounded for information. They did not even leave the injured Keth to die from their wounds. Human medical personnel moved through the battlefield, treating Varani civilians and Keth warriors with the same careful attention. And Wretch watched one of his warriors receive emergency surgery from a human doctor who had been shooting at that same warrior 20 minutes earlier. It made no sense the Keth took prisoners for ransom or labor, and they treated enemy wounded only if those wounded had value worth preserving. These humans treated wounded enemies because the enemies were wounded, as if the mere fact of injury created some obligation that transcended the violence that had caused it. Sergeant Wang approached the building where a group of Varani children had been gathered by Keth guards for processing into the labor shipments. The guards saw him coming and raised their weapons, and Wang did not slow down. 2 shots, 2 guards falling, and then he was inside the building and moving toward the sound of crying. The children were huddled in a storage room. 17 young Varani who had spent 3 days believing they would never see their families again. Wang knelt down to their level and spoke in a soft voice that his translation device rendered into their language. "You are safe now," he told them. "We are going to take you home." One of the children, a small girl with the golden fur that marked Varani youth, looked up at him with enormous eyes. "You came for us," she said, and her voice carried the confusion of someone who had stopped believing rescue was possible. Yes. Why? Wang did not have a complicated answer to give her. Because the answer was not complicated. Because you needed help, he said. And we were close enough to provide it. He carried that small girl 3 kilometers across the settlement to the medical evacuation shuttle because her legs were too weak from fear and hunger to make the journey on her own. His squad maintained a security perimeter around him the entire way. And when they reached the shuttle, a Varani elder named Mosseth was waiting with tears streaming down her face. "You sent so many soldiers," Mosseth said, and she could not seem to understand what she was seeing. "You sent warships and warriors and doctors, all for our small colony." Wang set the child down gently and made sure she was stable on her feet before he answered. "Your colony has 42,000 people," he said. "That is nothing compared to the great worlds of the Union." "Ma'am," Wang said, and something in his voice made the elder fall silent. "There is no number of people small enough that they do not deserve protection." Mosseth stared at him as if he had spoken words in a language she had never encountered. "The Keth told us no one would come," she said finally. "They told us the galaxy does not care about farmers on a moon that no one important has ever heard of. The Keth were wrong. But why?" Mosseth asked. And the question seemed to contain everything she had ever believed about how the universe worked. Why would humans die for strangers? Wang looked back at the settlement where his fellow soldiers were still securing buildings and treating wounded and carrying children to safety. "Because someone has to," he said. "And we decided a long time ago that it would be us, above the moon." Gethrak watched his fleet crumble and understood that he had made a terrible mistake. The humans were not bluffing. The humans had never been bluffing. And now he had only one option left. The distress signal arrived at the Regional Emergency Coordination Hub at precisely 3 in the morning. And Yun So-jin was the only human on duty when the alert flashed across her screen. She set down her cup of cold coffee and leaned forward, her eyes scanning the transmission data with practiced efficiency that came from 6 years of working among species who thought humans were too emotional for bureaucratic work. The signal came from Threshold 7, a small agricultural moon at the edge of Galactic Union space. and it carried the signature of the Varani Colonial Administration. Seo Jin pulled up the colony records while the message decoded itself on her secondary display. 42,000 Varani civilians lived on Threshold 7, making it one of their smaller settlements. And the colony specialized in growing a particular grain that served as a dietary staple for 17 different species across 3 sectors. The Varani themselves were gentle people, herbivores who had evolved on a peaceful world where the greatest predators were no larger than a house cat, and they had never developed the instincts for violence that so many other species carried in their blood. The decoded message appeared on her screen, and Seo Jin read it twice to make sure she understood correctly. A fleet of Keth marauder vessels had entered the system and established a blockade around the moon, and the Varani colonial governor was requesting appropriate defensive assistance as outlined in Section 4 of the Union Mutual Protection Compact. Seo Jin felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had seen Keth raids before, at least in the reports that crossed her desk, and she knew what a blockade formation meant. This was not a simple raid, where pirates grabbed what they could and fled before security forces arrived. This was a harvesting operation. The Keth intended to strip the colony of everything valuable, including its people. Her supervisor, a Morith named Thesik, emerged from his office chamber with the clicking sounds that indicated mild irritation at being disturbed during his rest. Cycle Thesik was an insectoid, being with 6 limbs and compound eyes that could see in spectrums humans could only imagine, and he had made it very clear over the years that he considered human emotional responses to be a professional liability. Liaison Yun, he said, his translator device rendering his clicks and whistles into flat synthetic speech. I see you have received the Varani transmission. I have. Coordinator. Thesik moved to her station and examined the data, with 3 of his eyes while the others watched her with what she had learned to recognize as suspicion. This is a straightforward matter, he said after a moment of consideration. The Keth presence registers as a Level 2 territorial dispute under Union classification protocols, which authorizes deployment of a standard security response. A standard security response, Seo Jin repeated, and she kept her voice carefully neutral. Correct. Which means 1 patrol vessel with a complement of approximately 30 security personnel, sufficient to establish Union presence and open negotiations with the Keth fleet commander. Dajin turned back to her display and pulled up the tactical analysis she had been running while Thesik spoke. The Keth fleet consisted of 14 vessels, including 1 heavy cruiser that served as the flagship, 4 medium raiders equipped for ground assault, and 9 support ships designed for cargo transport. Cargo transport meant they planned to take things. Cargo transport meant they planned to take people. Coordinator Thesik, she said, and she made sure her voice remained calm and professional. I am invoking Article 7C of the Union Defense Compact. The clicking from Thesik's throat became rapid and sharp, which was the Morith equivalent of sputtering in outrage. Article 7C is a human-specific amendment that has never been invoked in the 17 years since it was added to the compact. Then, it is past time someone used it. The article allows human representatives to override standard threat classification based on their own assessment, which the Union Council only permitted because they believed humans would have the wisdom to never actually exercise such authority. Seo Jin stood from her chair and faced her supervisor directly, something she rarely did because the height difference meant she had to look up at his thorax rather than his face. Article 7C allows me to request human military assistance when I determine that standard Union response is insufficient to protect civilian lives, she said, and each word came out clear and steady. I am making that determination now. You are overreacting. Desik said, and his compound eyes shifted through colors that indicated frustration. The Keth are raiders and opportunists, not conquerors, and they will negotiate once a Union vessel arrives to remind them that this colony has protection. The Keth have 14 ships in a harvesting formation around a colony of 42,000 civilians, including 12,000 children, Seo Jin replied. They are not here to negotiate. And what do you believe an appropriate response would be? Liaison Yun, given your human assessment of the situation. Seo Jin returned to her console and began composing the message that would travel through the quantum relay network to Earth Command Coordinator. Humans do not measure threats by what is attacking, she said as her fingers moved across the interface. We measure threats by what is at stake. That is not how rational threat assessment functions. No, Sojin agreed. It is how human threat assessment functions. The message was ready, and she attached her full tactical analysis along with the colony population data, the fleet composition estimates, and her personal recommendation based on 6 years of experience watching the galaxy fail to protect the vulnerable. She sent it before Desik could object further. For a long moment, the Morith coordinator stood in silence, his limbs twitching in patterns that suggested he was calculating the political implications of what had just occurred. You realize, he said finally, that if Earth Command responds at all, they will send whatever force they deem appropriate, based on their own doctrine rather than Union guidelines. Yes, human doctrine is not known for its restraint. No, it is not. Desik made a sound that the translator did not bother to convert, which meant it was either profanity or something so uniquely Morith that human language had no equivalent. What do you expect them to send? Liaison Yun, Seo Jin thought about the children on Threshold 7, about the Varani farmers who had never held a weapon in their lives, about the Keth ships hanging in orbit like predators waiting for the right moment to descend. She thought about what humanity did when the innocent were threatened. They will send. Enough, she said. Desik's eyes shifted again, and this time the color was one she did not recognize. Enough for what? Sajin looked at the star map on her display, at the small dot that represented a moon full of people who had asked for help and trusted that someone would answer. Enough to make sure those children see tomorrow, she said. And every tomorrow after that. The coordinator had no response to that. And eventually, he retreated to his office chamber without another word. Seo Jin sat back down at her station and waited for the response from Earth Command. It came 4 hours later, and it was only 3 words long: battalion en route. She read those words several times, and then she began to smile. The Varani had asked for help, humanity had answered. Now the Keth would learn what that meant. Warlord Gethrak stood on the command deck of his flagship and watched the small moon turn slowly beneath him. And he felt the satisfaction that came from knowing his prey had nowhere to run. The Varani colony was everything his scouts had promised it would be. 40,000 soft herbivores with no military training, no defensive weapons, and no allies close enough to matter. Their storage facilities held 3 seasons of harvested grain worth a fortune on the black markets of 6 different systems. And the colonists themselves would fetch excellent prices in the labor exchanges of the outer territories. This was the kind of raid that made reputations, and Gethrak intended to make his name legendary. Among the Keth clans, his second-in-command approached with a data tablet showing the latest scans of the colony surface. The civilians have gathered in their central settlements as expected, Warlord, and our ground teams report no resistance of any kind. Of course, there is no resistance, Gethrak said, and he bared his teeth in the expression his species used to show amusement. The Varani do not know how to resist, which is why they are perfect targets. We have received a transmission from something called the Regional Emergency Coordination Hub, his second continued. They are requesting that we enter negotiations regarding our presence in this system. Gethrak laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the command deck. Let them request whatever they wish. And by the time their single patrol ship arrives to wag a finger at us, we will be gone with everything worth taking. He turned back to the viewport and admired his fleet, spread across the orbital space around the moon, 14 ships under his command. With crews hardened by dozens of raids across the frontier sectors, nothing the Union could scramble in time would be enough to challenge him. And even if they sent something larger, the Keth had learned long ago that most species preferred negotiation to combat. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak made excuses for why they allowed it to happen. 3 days passed, and Gethrak broadcast his demands to the colony below: surrender all stored grain and processed food supplies, present 5,000 volunteers for labor conscription, and provide full access to colonial infrastructure for salvage assessment. The Varani governor pleaded for more time, claiming they needed to organize the transfer of materials. And Gethrak graciously allowed them additional hours because he knew that hope was the cruelest weapon of all. Let them hope that salvation was coming. Let them hope until the very last moment when they realized no one cared enough to save them. On the morning of the 4th day, his center officer made a sound of confusion. Warlord, we are detecting incoming vessels from the far edge of the system. The Union patrol ship, Gethrak said with a dismissive wave. One small vessel with a crew of bureaucrats pretending to be soldiers. No, Warlord, the censor officer said, and there was something strange in his voice. Not one vessel. Gethrak turned from the viewport and moved to the sensor station. The display showed a formation of ships emerging from faster-than-light transit, and the formation kept growing as more vessels appeared. 2 destroyers with hull configurations he recognized from intelligence reports as human military design, 4 frigates spreading into a defensive screen, 9 support vessels including medical ships, supply carriers, and what appeared to be a mobile command platform, and at the center of the formation, a carrier that dwarfed everything else in the system, including his own flagship. What is this? Gethrak demanded. Human vessels, his second-in-command said, and the words came out quiet and uncertain. The markings indicate they are from something called the 142nd Rapid Deployment Battalion. Battalion, Gethrak repeated, and the word felt wrong in his mouth. Warlord, I am reading over 3,000 combat personnel across that fleet, not including ship crews. Gethrak stared at the display as the human formation settled into a position between his fleet and the planet. This was impossible. The Varani were a minor colony with no strategic importance, no political connections, and no resources valuable enough to warrant this kind of response. No species sent a battalion for a simple raid. No species committed this level of military force for strangers. A cons communication request flashed on the display, and Gethrak accepted it because he could not think of what else to do. The face that appeared on his screen was human, with dark eyes and short gray hair, and an expression that held no fear and no anger and no uncertainty. This is Colonel Park Minho of the Terran Defense Force 142nd Battalion, the human said. I am addressing the commander of the Keth fleet currently in violation of Galactic Union protected space. Gethrak found his voice somewhere in his confusion. I am Warlord Gethrak, and you are interfering in Keth clan business. Your clan business involves threatening 42,000 civilians under Union protection, the colonel replied, and his tone remained flat and calm. You have 6 hours to withdraw your fleet beyond Union borders, and this is not a negotiation. 6 hours, Gethrak said, and he forced himself to laugh, even though the sound came out weaker than he intended. Human, you may have brought impressive numbers, but the Keth do not flee from threats. I have not made a threat, the colonel said. I have given you a timeline, and when it expires, my battalion will remove you from this system. Remove us, Gethrak repeated. You speak as if this outcome is certain. It is, the colonel said. And then the transmission ended. Gethrak stood in silence as his bridge crew watched him for guidance. His second-in-command stepped closer and spoke in a low voice. Warlord, the stories about humans may have some truth to them. Stories are for frightening children. These stories say humans do not calculate acceptable losses the way other species do. And they say humans will spend any price to protect those they consider under their care. Gethrak looked at the sensor display again. At the fleet of human ships sitting between him and his prize, 6 hours was enough time to withdraw, to take his fleet and find easier targets in systems where humans had no presence. But withdrawal would destroy his reputation among the clans. And reputation was everything to a Keth warlord. We stay, he decided. The humans are bluffing because no species actually commits this much force for people they have never met. The hours passed slowly. The human fleet remained motionless. And the 6-hour deadline approached with the inevitability of gravity. Gethrak watched the countdown on his display and told himself that the humans would negotiate once they saw he would not back down. The final minute ticked away. Then, the final second, the colonel's face appeared on his screen one last time. Your time is up, the human said, and now we negotiate. Gethrak replied with confidence. He no longer felt. No, the colonel said. Now we begin. The transmission ended, and the human fleet started to move.